Hey YouTube! Some people have been asking me for advice on how to start cactus seeds. Basically, any method with consistent moisture and temperature can work for germination, and people do it all sorts of ways. But in the wild, a lot of cacti go through a rainy season of about 2 to 4 months, which is what we basically aim to mimic. This is also usually during the warm season, so it's good to aim for temperatures in the 70s or 80s to get good germination. Typical indoor temperatures are usually fine under lights, but heat mats don't hurt. It's a good idea to get a thermostat for heat mats though, so you can control the temperature. You can use almost any soil mix, but I usually get peat-based potting soil and heavily amend it with pumice or perlite. Even pure sand or pure vermiculite will work for germination, but might come with little peculiarities. Like pure sand, you might have to heavily fertilize, or pure vermiculite, you might have to transplant them early on. The first few months, the roots are really short and just barely help the seedlings stand up. So it makes it really easy to transplant them. If your seedlings look perfectly healthy, it's possible to go like many more months before taking them out of humidity, like up to a year. But the wet conditions for long periods invite fungus, which is the main thing we want to avoid. Algae and moss can also compete with the seedlings. They can be benign, but also they can get out of control, and they compete for the real estate with your seedlings. If extra biological activity gets really high in there, it might mean there's insects that are spreading a lot of spores and making the conditions funkier. Oversowing isn't a big problem, but be prepared to transplant the seedlings earlier. It can be really tedious to transplant a bunch of seedlings, but some people prefer to really tediously sow the seeds to begin with to avoid it on the back end. It's just a preference thing. And there's a couple of different ways you can go about sanitizing your soil. The first way that most people encounter is the microwave method. It can work, but you need kind of a little bit of luck with it. Basically, the microbes that repopulate after you nuke your soil, they could be good or bad. It just depends. I'm not a big fan of it because it makes your whole house smell bad to cook soil. I've read that you can overcook the soil, which makes a kind of logical sense to me. Like, if you overcook certain things in the microwave, it makes them doughy or hard, right? The microwaves also heat unevenly, so you might have to stir this really hot soil and then reheat it again. It's just a whole mess. You have to wait for it to cool down before you can use it, which means you also have to plan out ahead how much you need, and hopefully you get just the right amount and not too much or too little. And also, I've melted plastic containers. If you choose the wrong containers, it's a mess and you have to start over, and it's not fun. The other way to sanitize your soil is with chemicals, mainly fungicides. And they're very convenient because, well, one, it doesn't stink up your house because you don't have to cook anything, and you don't have to wait for anything to cool down, so you can prepare just the right amount in the pot and soak it with your fungicide, and you're good to go. The other thing is, after you sow the seeds, you can spray it down with your chemical solution, and it sanitizes the seeds as well, or your top dressing, or whatever you put. But a downside would be that you have to be more diligent about safety. Like you probably should use gloves, maybe even some kind of eye protection. Um, Another downside is you can mix more than you need, and then it's kind of a waste, and you have to figure out how to get rid of it. Um, I use Captan and Fisan. Fisan 20 seems harder to get, and I think it's maybe more toxic, but I'm not sure. People use all sorts of different containers to start seeds. Um, One of the classic ways is the baggie method, where you put a pot inside a Ziploc baggie. And it works. It's cheap. Everybody has Ziploc baggies, so it's pretty accessible. But some things that are annoying is everybody says, "Oh, just crack open your Ziploc bag when you're ready to introduce some air." But if you tried to ever do it, the bag flips over and it doesn't really let in air, and you end up rigging it up with maybe a steak or I don't know. But it's kind of annoying. And then also there's usually print on the side, and then between that and condensation, the visibility is okay in the Ziploc baggie method. So it's doable, but it's not my favorite. I started using takeout containers. Actually, I bought a stack of these Glad takeout containers from Costco, so they're all clean. And they work good for kind of bulk sewing. They're cheap too, like especially if you reuse takeout containers. But when you look at the seedlings, they're not always very visible because of the condensation, right? And usually I end up flicking the top with my finger, and it knocks off the condensation, but then the water falls on the plants. So that's not great. Also, it's recommended to put holes on the bottom if you do this method, but then it lets the fungus gnats in if you have fungus gnats around. You could do it with no holes, but you have to get the moisture level just right inside. The method I've been kind of favoring lately, which I've seen somewhere, I feel like maybe Mexican cactus growers or maybe Asian cactus growers, but it's putting pots inside of just clear plastic bags, just cheap ones. I go to the dollar store and they have these party favor bags, and it's 20 for $1. So it's real cheap, and it's easy to see the seedlings usually, even with a little bit of condensation. The condensation doesn't land on the plants ever. They're easy to slowly open when you want to acclimate the plants. And surface level, it seems like, Ziploc bags are better quality. But I think these might be better, and they're actually a little cheaper. One downside is your pots don't neatly tuck against each other if you use this method, but it's kind of the same for the regular baggie method, so it's not really a big deal. And you gotta be a little careful of not damaging the cheaper plastic, but hasn't really been an issue either. Another method that's popular is using 10 by 20 flats, like nursery flats. I would rate this as like a commercial scale type of sewing. And usually they'll wrap the whole thing in like saran wrap, like cling film. And then you can't really see the seedlings, and it's kind of a crapshoot. Like, a lot of people, they'll just leave it covered for half a year or a year, and then they open it up, and it's like an unboxing, and you see what you got. Which, it's okay. You could get really rewarded or really disappointed. And I've seen a lot of, videos and scenarios where people open it up, and there's a lot of moss in there and a few seedlings. It's really cacti. They like air, I think you're better off taking them out a little earlier, maybe being able to monitor them. Top dressing's great. It can really help support the seedlings so they stand upright. Just don't put on too thick, and if it's too heavy or bulky, then it can suppress the germination. After the seeds germinate, watch for fungus gnats or insects, and moldy or unhappy seedlings. If everything looks good, you can just keep them covered. If things start going bad, don't be afraid to uncover them and deal with issues. Sometimes you get light outbreaks of fungus, and you can open the container, remove the concentrated bits of fungus, like on dead seedlings, and you just spray them with diluted hydrogen peroxide or a fungicide spray, and then you just close them back up. The biggest danger to survival is usually the initial wet phase here. Even though they're kind of on autopilot in the humidity, you can have better success if you monitor them every couple days and you watch for any signs you might need to open the container. Once they start getting their first spines, then cactus seedlings are usually surprisingly resilient to the open air, and you can transplant them. A lot of people say to gradually introduce seedlings to dryness, but it's not as crucial as I was first led to believe. Seedlings do take a while to harden off to a drier environment, but it's actually pretty quick. If you have a good way to do it gradually, like a takeout container or the party favor bags, then more power to you. If you take seedlings straight out and transplant them, it's almost always fine too. Just taking action is better than overthinking the acclimation. You might want to spare them the intense light for about 5 days after transplanting. If you transplant them in a mix that's a little bit more adult, then they tend to start taking off a little bit. You might want to have a finer moisture retaining layer on the top for the seedlings to transition their roots down to the more adult area. And if you totally saturate the soil, like by bottom watering, then you should expect to be watering your seedlings maybe 2 or 3 times a week so they stay pretty moist. Gradually you can decrease how much you give them, but if they shrivel or turn purple, you might be leaving them too dry. There's no perfect formula, it's just whatever works. Nature doesn't really put seedlings in baggies or transplant them, but in nature, most seeds don't germinate or survive to adulthood. The biggest key to success is just try things and have patience. They take forever to grow, but if you just start them now, then eventually time passes and you'd be surprised how much they've grown. Here's an experiment. It's just a wicking setup, and I sowed the seeds in the open air like this, and they germinated, and it stays consistently moist, which is what the cactus seeds want. So far so good. There's probably better methods to germinate cactus seedlings that we don't even know of yet, so if everybody experiments, all the better.